Good morning, Loveland. I'm Mike Meldon, and this is the Loveland Weekly Podcast, brought to you by Gina Dubell-Smith, eXp Realty, and Stone Pillar Farms. The Grail, or Grailville, has been in the news a lot lately, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And we have a lot of events there, my nonprofit called Love Our Land. But when I speak to people about the Grail, they seem to know little about it, its history, or oftentimes they've never heard of it. And so I thought that'd be an interesting podcast to talk to somebody that knows a lot about the Grail. And so I did. I met with a woman that has been a member at the Grail for decades, and she's also a staff member there, Lu Hageman. And we got to talking about the history of the Grail and her role, and I might have to divide this into a couple different episodes. So this episode is going to mainly just focus on the history of this organization that lies just less than a mile from downtown Loveland, that many of us may not be quite sure of what's going on up there. Enjoy. Today is Monday, July 3rd, 2023.
Okay, well, the Grail started in Holland in 1920s by a Jesuit priest and 5 of his women students. His thought at the time was that the world is missing the opportunity to utilize women's talents, and that women have a lot to bring to transforming the world. And he pursued this from a spiritual base. And that is pretty much where the Grail has been coming from all of these years, that spiritual base and the empowerment of women. Then in the 5 women initially kind of split up the world and decided they were going to go to different places. And so one woman went to Australia, and then someone who went to Australia died and had to be replaced. But in the meantime, 2 women had headed off to North America. And so they couldn't be diverted to Australia in those days. The story is that they came on the last boat out of Holland before Hitler took over. Now, I've also heard that's just a story. They came on one of the last boats, I'm sure of that. And they came to New York and found that the money they had was no good anymore. So they were pretty much at the mercy of whatever might happen. And they had been invited initially by the Archbishop of Chicago to come to his diocese and work there. And in the meantime, the Archbishop died. And so here they were with no money and an invitation that wasn't good anymore. And they were met in New York by Catherine Leahy, who was one of the original members of the Grail and who spent practically her entire career at Grailville here. But in the meantime, they did go to the Archdiocese of Chicago, settled into a camp there in Libertyville, Illinois, and were asked by the then Archbishop to run a camp for boys. And they did that for a bit, but decided this is not their mission.
Right. Yeah.
And so they divided up. Lidwine van Kersbergen and Joan Overbos were the 2 women who came, and they gathered around them a number of young women, a few young women, and then they set out looking for a place to call home that would fit with their mission. And they ended up coming to Cincinnati. the Archbishop in Cincinnati welcomed them and gave a loan to initially make the initial purchase of Grailville. And so the story there is that they were looking for a place, and there was a place down the road a bit that they went to see, down O'Bannonville Road, and decided it was too small, wasn't going to work for a number of reasons. But when they passed this place with the Victorian house and all the buildings, they said, this is the place. Well, it wasn't for sale, but they talked the owner into selling it to them anyhow.
That's crazy. I just assumed that they were built by the Grail.
No. What happened then is that as time went on, then they had all this space. It was on a farm, and the women were running the farm. More women came. They started immediately doing programming and inviting women to programs. And the women would come and become fascinated, become inspired, and would come back and be here for what was then called the year school, which was a year-long program. So that gave some stability. And then as the women came, and if they stayed longer, they would become staff, and it just grew from there. So it was on a farm. They were milking the cows. The farmer that had worked for the previous owner stayed on for a while until the women could take the whole thing on themselves. So it was quite a challenge, but they did it, and they ran some wonderful programs, which was proven by the fact that so many women wanted to come back and work with the Grail. Those programs were really designed to empower women, to build a strong spiritual base. Now, this was all Roman Catholic to start with, and was in the early days, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. And so the life was based on kind of a work and prayer sort of modality. And so there was time for prayer in the day, people worked, there was study, a lot of study. There were classes held where the women who had become staff would be teaching the others in various skills, in various the arts, in spirituality, and liturgy was a big focus, and farming, of course, and the domestic arts as well. There was a whole arts program that was developed, too, over time. And that arts program became quite large and developed into a kind of a business that helped to sustain the place as well as the women coming initially would pay tuition to come to programs. The women who were on the staff here were working just for subsistence and room and board, basically. And it was everyone was very mission-oriented and wanting to make it work. There wasn't, nobody was paid big bucks in those days. And that went on, that year school modality went on until the mid to late 60s, somewhere in there. And then there were fewer women able to come because they had to be on about getting a college education, getting their families taken care of, and so on. So getting married and that kind of thing. And also, another thing that was happening at the time is that the staff wanted to move on and do some other things, get out in the world and talk about transforming the world. Right. So people moved on, both staff and students, and there were fewer staff and fewer students coming. And so that's when they did some programs with colleges then in those days. where students would come who were enrolled in a college, and they would get credit for the various programs they participated on site. And that was another whole program effort that was a bit different from the year school, because the year school was very much residential, very much an integrated lifestyle.
How many people during the year school, approximately how many people would come for that time, for the year?
We would have anywhere from 50 to 70 people here, which included staff and students.
And if you went to the year school, you stayed here? Or did
you
have to?
No, you lived here and you worked here and studied
what
here.
A community.
Yeah.
50 to 70 people, that's a lot. That's great.
Yeah.
Wow. And then, but in the 1960s, that started to fall off. So you needed to figure out how to keep it rolling. And so it was more people coming. They would come for classes.
They would come as part of their college program. It was a field placement before field placements really became popular at colleges, and so a number of students came to those programs. But eventually, that became a popular thing with college classes, and a lot more opportunities for placements came to be, and there were again fewer staff to manage such a program. So then it went from there to becoming a retreat center, where the facilities would be rented out to the groups to come and have their own programs, do their own programs. And at the same time, concurrent with that, we would be doing some programs as well. And so that went on for a number of years, and really only ended more recently. And people could come and they would stay here. Early in our programming efforts, we were attracting a national audience, but then as time went on, it became much more local. And so toward the end, the retreat center wasn't doing as well financially. It wasn't really able to support itself, and that's when we had to close the retreat center. And then, so then I guess we're where we are now, where we've sold 120 acres to the Claremont County Park District, a couple of other small pieces, and now we're looking to sell another 109 acres.
And what's left over here? How many acres are on this side?
And 70 acres. We will retain 70 acres. And that 70 acres, we are hoping to do a lot of different things with. We want to remain true to our initial vision and maintain those values, but find the ways that are pertinent and ways that are applicable and relevant to now.
In Loveland City News, good news if you're listening to this podcast and you're interested in the Grail. Part of the land that the Grail is meaning to sell off has now been approved by our city council to go into negotiations with the Cardinal Conservancy. And they are an environmental group that, at least for my personal reasons, I'm very happy that they're getting involved in this and hopefully going to own the land one day. Looking ahead in Loveland, Trailside Tunes Voodoo Child on Saturday, July 8th from 1 to 3 p.m. at the new gazebo at Nisbet Park. And tomorrow is the big 4th of July party in Loveland. I spoke about it the last podcast, so if you need details, you can check that out or go online. But there's plenty to do all day long for everyone of all ages. I hope to see you there, and have a happy 4th of July. We have something truly special here in Loveland. Thank you for listening, and have a great week.